You're listening to The Outcue, a 21 News journalist perspective on a top news story.
Good afternoon. It is Friday, November 1st. I am Assistant News Director Justin Mitchell, and this is The Outcue. And this week, what we're going to talk about is another one of these areas where there's reality and there's rhetoric, and they don't always get along with each other all that well. And this has to do with weather. So, for instance, there have been two major hurricanes recently, and there's been always an injection into the political spectrum, talk of what causes them and what the impacts are, and you hear from viewers. And so with me today, I've got Eric Wilhelm and Andrew DiPaolo, and what I want to do, guys, is just get into the weeds. What do people, regular people, viewers, and politicians seem to get wrong about weather as it relates to things like climate change?
How much time do we have?
Long as you want.
Well, there's many things, and everything these days gets political, of course, unfortunately. That's just the reality we live in. And it happens that we had bad hurricane damage in a swing state before an election this year. So, of course, it got even more political. But the bottom line is we had, kind of an unusual couple of storms in the southeast, and that caused a lot of destruction, devastation, unfortunately some loss of life. And so the question is, was this a completely natural occurrence or not? And that's something that is not easily explainable, but we try our best, that's for sure.
So how much control do people have? Because I think I think there are people who have this perception that everything is natural. Mm-hmm. And then people who have this perception that there is a almost Machiavellian ability to control what's happening, and neither of these are true.
The truth, as usual, is somewhere kind of in the middle. That's for sure. What can people do when it comes to natural disasters? Not much, generally speaking, because natural disasters are natural. They're going to happen. And the best thing to do is to secure your property as best you can and prepare ahead of time, especially if you live in a prone area, susceptible area to natural hazards, especially hurricanes and tornadoes. So that's what most people can do. When you zoom out to the 30,000 foot view of these things, if people are really worried about climate change in particular, it's hard to point to individual actions that you can do to change the grand scheme of things. I usually tell people the best thing you can do is prepare as best you can on an individual level, you and your family, but also do the thing that you have the most power to do, and that's in the voting booth. Make sure that you're electing people that can enact larger scale changes than just individual people can.
So to that point, climate change is a real thing, right? Sure. That's generally a settled thing, correct? I know that in the political sphere it may not be, but scientifically it is.
Yes.
But guys, explain how that works, because again, my understanding as a non-expert on this is there's not a storm that is caused by climate change. Right. It's way more complex than that. So how does that work?
We were just talking about this upstairs. How I look at it as, a meteorologist, but not a climate expert, is weather is short-term, climate is long-term. So not one singular event can be climate change, but the addition of more of these events that might be anomalies might be a hint that our climate is changing. So if you have one really bad hurricane, that's not climate change. But if you have hurricanes that are stronger and later into the season, that might be caused by Gulf waters that are well above the average, well, those warming Gulf waters are a factor of climate change. So climate change are the factors that are driving these kind of anomaly weather events.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there are several analogies I use that some work better on some audiences than others. But if you're a baseball fan, what I usually like to point to is if you are a longtime baseball fan, the late 90s was a home run boom. Home runs were flying out of parks like crazy. Turns out a lot of those guys were on steroids. Now, can you say because they were on steroids, every home run they hit was because they were on steroids? No. Some of those home runs would have occurred anyway. But the chances of any swing resulting in a home run were higher because they were on steroids. And when it comes to climate and climate change and individual events, can you say each individual event was caused directly by climate change? No, But climate change, the fact that it's happening, increases the odds that any individual event turns more extreme.
Yeah, and the one thing, I've got a few friends and neighbors that, just tell me, listen, I don't believe in climate change at all, period. And the one thing I always tell them is, when I was in my scouting days and camping, there was a thing we always used to say, leave no trace. So even if you're somebody at home going, I don't believe in climate change at all, just try and make your property, where you live, a little bit cleaner. We're trying to leave this earth a little bit cleaner for our next generation, a little bit better, right? You always want to leave a legacy for yourself individually. I kind of look at it like that and tell people that. Let's just say, you're somebody at home, you absolutely do not believe in climate change. Well, just make sure you're home, you're picking up trash, you're litter on the side of the road. It's as simple as that, just trying to make the world and the globe a little bit of a cleaner place. I kind of think it can be that basic, that simple, to try and make things a little bit more sustainable here.
Now, when you see the long-term climate change figures where it'll say it always appears to me as a, just a lay person, you look at, it seems like it's very subtle. It'll be, a point of a degree or a degree here or there over X amount of time. And it sounds like, well, even if it's real, that's not a big deal, is it? But that's overly simplistic, right?
It is, and it is those tenths of a degree over time, they certainly add up. And we even in just day-to-day weather talk about pretty small numbers that are fairly significant. When we say winter is going to be a degree warmer than the average, that sounds like, a degree, no big deal. That's 1 degree. But a degree warmer than the average can be a significantly higher than average number when you're talking about a time scale of months or years or centuries and things like that. So while these may seem like small numbers, they can really make a big difference in the long term.
Is it all man-made? I mean, is there a natural, I've heard that argument too, that climate change is just a natural cycle that the Earth goes through. Is there something to that also? Is it a combination?
There's something to that, yes, but the majority of it, and you can't really even put a percentage on it, but the majority of it is human caused by emissions, especially over the last century. Now, there's some natural component to it, sure, but that pales in comparison to the impact that carbon emissions have had on the atmosphere.
And that doesn't need to be a political thing, right? I mean,
No,
that's
it shouldn't.
just,
It's all scientific.
Right.
It's all data.
Yeah.
I mean, this when we talk about it on the air, we're talking about it as scientists. We're not talking about it as any way to drive what you think or how you think politically. I mean, we're telling you factual information, scientific information, because that's what we study day to day, and that's plain and simple. There's no rhetoric, there's no political bias. It's all stats and data.
yeah, and we're all living on the same planet, so it's a little baffling when this is a thing that we fight about. It is what it is. It's just, it is not. There are plenty of Republicans who understand this. There are plenty of Democrats, I imagine, who don't. I mean, they've got maybe a job that puts, smokestacks in the air, and they say, no. I mean, this doesn't need to blur. This should blur lines. Everybody should just be able. Is there a water's edge we can reach at some point? For a field that already gets its fair share of people complaining of what they perceive as inaccuracy, which is false.
Sure.
How do you tune that out and just keep doing what you do? I mean, like Andrew just said, you're coming at you as a scientist.
It can be a challenge, that's for sure. And in my experience, I've been doing this long enough now that I am able to shut out the haters, if you will, and shut out the climate deniers a little bit easier. I also, just on a day-to-day basis, there are times that our forecast gets some aspect of the forecast goes awry. And we hear about it, especially in the winter. And with time, you just grow a little bit of a thicker skin and just, accept the reality that there's a certain percentage of people who just are never going to be happy, or they just like to, find someone to yell at. And sometimes that's your local weather person.
Right. Right. I think too, in the wintertime, there's so many sources to get weather information, and a lot of those are just not going to be parallel to what we're forecasting. A lot of people will tell me, well, my app says this many inches of snow, which is the most annoying thing on planet Earth for us as meteorologists who might have just got done with a shift of forecasting winter. And then the first person you see goes, my app says this. I like to redirect them to, hey, you know what? We're forecasting this. This is kind of what we're seeing, maybe it's a clipper system, or maybe it's a nor'easter. Kind of take them through some of the basic science and tell them a little bit about, hey, we've got this app that we manually write the information on the app, and that's unique with our app here locally. No one's other weather app does that here locally. So kind of redirecting at least one person makes me feel better at night. But yeah.
Well, and I think it also depends on their approach. I mean, I can think there was an email just this week, Eric, that brought up some of this exact topics that we're discussing. Yeah. But they were relatively respectful, but they were asking why they don't see more of an explanation of some of this. And you did respond, and you pointed to where it has been explained and where it's regularly explained. We did a show in, what was it, 2019?
2019, I believe.
Yeah, after all the one of the flooding incidents in Boardman.
Yeah, that was right in the heart of all those flooding instances that seemed to hit Boardman over and over again.
Yeah, and so, going back to that doesn't seem like it's happening as much anymore.
Yeah, we haven't had as many, but these things will keep on happening. It's just the last couple of years have been quieter for sure. Yeah.
So, if you could just talk to everybody about what you wish they understood better, and take as long as you need on that. But what do you wish that people took more of an effort to understand?
That there's no agenda when it comes to our forecast, both the 7-day forecast, and then when we do talk about climate issues and other sciencey kind of issues, there's no agenda, there's no pushing of one side over the other. We deal in facts, and that doesn't mean that we're perfect by any stretch of the imagination. Just like any other weather forecast, there's going to be times that it is more challenging and we get certain aspects of it wrong. But we're always upfront about that, and we don't try to hide anything. Whenever, especially in the winter, when the stakes are raised a little bit as far as getting snow amounts right and that sort of thing. If we have a bad forecast bust, we are pretty straightforward and honest about it. I'll come right out and say, hey, that forecast wasn't good. And people do appreciate that. We'll continue to do that. And I just hope that people will have some grace and some patience with us sometimes, and just keep in mind that we're trying our best.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize that we aren't trying to spin some sort of agenda. I mean, we're just, trying to convey the information that we're looking at, the data that we're looking at, and bring you a forecast to communicate the best that we can. I say it all the time during severe weather season. You want to, I'm going to forget the phrase now. We don't want to sensationalize anything. We don't want to scare people. We want to communicate the information as best as we can, and not put a spin on anything. If there's no threat for a big winter storm or a really bad severe weather event, we're not going to come out and say like, oh no, you better make sure you're in the basement all afternoon. You don't want to scare people. You don't want to scare. You want to prepare. That's the phrase. There you go.
When some of these topics like climate change become so in the political sphere, is there I know there's not, because you guys talk about this, but is there sort of almost a chilling effect you have to get past? For instance, in news, there are things that I know if we report on, and we're going to report on them fairly, but I know there's a certain segment of the population that is going to say, well, there you go, that's an agenda because I reject that premise, even if the premise is reality. If I say, for instance, well, I'm concerned about democracy, that's a nonpartisan statement, but there are people who will read partisanship into it, right?
Sure.
So how do you push through that?
It can be a challenge, that's for sure. The best way we have found to push through that and communicate these things the best we can is to push people more to our digital side. Because in a newscast, we've talked some about climate change this afternoon, and obviously we acknowledge it's happening, and that all that is true, but we don't talk about it much in our newscast because we just don't have time. This is a complicated topic. And so what I try to do is push people to the venues that we can take a little more time to explain these things and elaborate. And this is a great venue that we're on today.
Yeah.
This is a podcast that we're not limited by time, and we can stretch our legs a little bit on these topics. It's just hard to do on a 3-minute weathercast from night to night, for sure.
Yeah, and I love when we report on individuals that are trying to find, whether it be at YSU or just different individuals in the Youngstown area, or find more ways to do things more sustainably. Because going back to the litter comment I made a few minutes ago, whether you're out there and you believe in climate change or not, I just don't understand why you wouldn't want to make the world we live in a clean place, a more sustainable. Sustainability doesn't really have anything to do with climate change. I mean, yes, it helps with the carbon footprint, right, ultimately. But I mean, if you're just making the world a cleaner place, shouldn't that be the ultimate goal? Make the world you live in a better place.
I mean, even if you make it a selfish thing, like just like it's nicer to look around if things aren't gross.
If your grass is long, don't you want to go outside and cut your grass? I mean, if we have the basic example there, I mean,
right.
You just want to make the world you live in a little bit less, a little bit more clean and more sustainable for our next generation.
So can individuals make a difference? I mean, I know there's a certain sense that I've run into with people where it's sort of, listen, I'll do what I can, but putting this on me is unfair. There's, billion-dollar companies who are doing way more harm than I am.
And people blame other countries
and
too.
you can blame another country, and you can blame. So what's it? Why is it worth? Like, yes, it's nice to keep my yard clean and cut.
Yeah.
But is that making a difference?
On an individual level, not much, of course. And what I tell people is that the best thing you can do is to elect people who are, at the very least, not climate deniers, and then going beyond that, a step beyond that, the ones who are passionate enough about this to actually make changes on a level that individuals are not capable of doing, individual people who aren't politicians. So that's where I go to answer questions like that, for sure.
There's some really small scale stuff. I mean, it's not really much, but I mean, it's small scale stuff. I mean, you can plant a pollinator garden in your yard and helps with the bee population. I mean, we're talking real small scale stuff, but even creating throwing your trash into the garden and making a compost pile, that sort of thing. Smaller scale stuff, but there's little things we can do to kind of help things a little bit.
And even if you aren't saving the world doing that kind of thing,
exactly.
there's still good things to do,
Yeah.
And as for the bigger saving the world things, I think maybe that's a thing people don't understand too, and this is exploited by politicians, that there's a way to do that can create jobs and help the economy. It doesn't mean just shutting industries down.
Right. Exactly.
And so I think maybe that's the conversation that the politicians ought to be having,
Agreed.
as opposed to, don't listen to people who went to school for this.
Yeah.
I mean, are there things you want to talk about here that we haven't gotten into yet? Anything that you want to add to this?
Well, my annual winter forecast is coming up on November the 11th. Now, we've had a few really, really warm winters in a row, almost record warm winters. And this upcoming winter, hint, I don't think we'll change that trend all that much. And so our warm winters of late have raised the topic a little more often about climate change. Even in landlocked Ohio and western Pennsylvania, when you get hardly any snow, not just one winter, but a few winters in a row, some people are coming around to the idea that this is a real thing. Not to say our winters over the last few are exclusively climate change driven, but again, the odds are tilted in favor of more extreme seasons, winter or any other season, because of the rapid warming of not only the atmosphere, but the oceans as well. The ocean water temperatures are very, very important when it comes to a winter forecast, and the Pacific Ocean right now is extremely, extremely warm, and that has big implications.
And that goes to what you were saying earlier about one warm winter is not necessarily a sign of anything, but we're how many in a row now?
And it's not exclusive to us. We're exactly where we are, but the country as a whole has been on the warm side for a few winters in a row, and going back a couple of decades, yes, there's been some cold winters, but the warm winters are far outnumbering the cold ones right now.
Yeah, and what Eric just did was, it's easy to stand on a screen and say something is climate change, but when you're backing it up with looking at analogs from past winters, or this factor, that factor, we're explaining via science why maybe our climate is changing, or why our winters are becoming warmer, or why maybe hurricanes are getting happening later into the season. There's science in all of this stuff, deep-rooted science in all of this. We're not just standing on a screen going, climate change, that's it. No, this is why our climate is changing. This is what's happening and leading to this. There's an equation and there's a solution. It's as simple as that.
And I think combating the anecdotal is the difficult thing, because that gets to this point, that when something happens that's an outlier, it doesn't necessarily mean anything. But the counter that I hear from a lot of people is like, well, I remember this winter, like like 2-3 years ago, I remember it was so cold that one day that it hurt to get gas. Now, how's the climate warming when it's that cold in winter?
Yeah.
That was one day that winter.
Yeah.
That was one day.
We hear that at every snowstorm as well. Oh, love that global warming, whenever they're shoveling snow.
So I think that is the thing that people need to understand more, is that we're talking about trends.
Yes.
We're talking about long-term things.
Yes.
There's no anecdote you can point to that is a counter to that.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, guys, I appreciate it. This has been,
Yeah.
I think, informative. I hope that it gets people to at least, read a little more, watch a little more on, that you guys put online as well as on the newscasts, and just understand nobody's got an axe to grind here. There's nobody, neither of you own stock in the big weather machine.
Big oil guys over here.
Or do we?
No, this is really all just like what we do in news and what you do in weather. This is public service. We're not out to get you, and we're not and we're not opposed to or in favor of your favorite politician or leader or business or whatever. This is just those are the facts. Do with them what you will.
Yeah, me personally, and I could probably speak for you, we don't care who you vote for. We really don't. What we care about is making sure that we're out there communicating this information to the public and providing you with the best, most accurate forecast you could possibly have anywhere around, and going about our day. And that's it. As simple as it is.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate it. This has been, and we'll see you next week on, hopefully we'll be talking about something decisive about next week's election and not talking about indecision and chaos. But until then, this has been the Outcue.